The market district of Rome smelled of spices, sweat, and desperation in equal measure. Flavia moved through the crowded stalls with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate chaos while carrying the most precious cargo imaginable. Her 3-month-old son, Marcus, wrapped in a threadbare sling against her chest. The infant had stopped crying 2 hours ago, which should have been a relief, but instead filled her with a mother's particular terror. Hungry babies cried. Silent babies were giving up. She couldn't let him give up. "Bread," a vendor called out, waving a loaf that made Flavia's stomach clench with longing. "Fresh this morning. Only 3 bronze coins. 3 bronze coins." She had one. One coin that she'd earned by washing other people's clothes in the public fountain until her hands cracked and bled. One coin that represented 12 hours of labor. One coin that would buy perhaps a quarter of that loaf, and even that would be gone by tomorrow. "Please," Flavia said, approaching the vendor's stall. "I have 1 coin. Could you spare even a small piece? My son, he hasn't eaten properly in days." The vendor, a heavy-set man with flour dusting his forearms, looked at her with the weary expression of someone who heard similar pleas a dozen times a day. "1 coin won't buy you anything here, girl. Maybe try the day-old stall at the other end of the market. They might take pity." "I've been there," Flavia replied quietly. "They have nothing left." "Then I'm sorry," the vendor said, not unkindly, "but I've got my own family to feed. Can't be giving away bread to every—" He stopped, seemingly catching himself before saying something cruel. "Try the Temple of Ceres. Sometimes they give out grain to widows." "I've tried the temple," Flavia said, though she knew there was no point in continuing this conversation. "They say there are too many widows now, that the emperor's wars have created more than the gods can feed." The vendor's expression darkened. "Watch what you say about the emperor, girl. Even in the market there are ears." Flavia nodded and moved away, clutching Marcus closer. She hadn't meant it as criticism, just as statement of fact. Her husband, Lucius, had died 6 months ago in Dacia, fighting in the emperor's expansion campaigns. She'd received official notification of his death, his military discharge pay of exactly 40 denarii, and nothing else. No pension, no support, no acknowledgement that her husband's sacrifice had left a widow and an infant with no means of survival. The 40 denarii had seemed like a fortune at first, but Rome was expensive, and a woman alone with a child commanded higher rent from suspicious landlords. The money had drained away like water through cupped hands. Rent, food, oil for lamps, wood for heating. And now, 3 months later, she was down to her last coin and had nowhere left to turn. As evening approached and the market began to close, Flavia found herself sitting on the steps of the Temple of Mars, exhausted and defeated. Marcus stirred against her chest, making small sounds that meant he was waking up and would soon realize, again, that there was no milk. She'd tried to find work as a wet nurse, the one job that seemed obvious for a woman in her situation. But the wealthy families who could afford to hire wet nurses wanted healthy, well-fed women whose milk was abundant. Flavia, thin from hunger and stress, her own milk drying up from malnutrition, was turned away at every door. "You could sell your body," one of the other desperate women in her tenement had suggested, not cruelly but practically, as one might suggest selling furniture. "The brothels near the Circus Maximus always need new girls. They'd give you room and board, at least." But Flavia couldn't, not because of moral superiority. She was in no position to judge anyone's survival strategies, but because what would happen to Marcus? Who would care for an infant while his mother serviced clients? What kind of life would that be for him, growing up in a brothel, breathing that air, seeing those things? No, there had to be another way. As the sun set and the market emptied, Flavia made her way back to her small room in the Subura district. It was barely large enough for a sleeping mat, and had walls so thin she could hear every conversation, every argument, every moment of passion or violence in the surrounding rooms. But it was shelter, however inadequate, and she had paid rent through the end of the week. After that, she had no idea what would happen. That night, after Marcus had finally exhausted himself from crying and fallen into a fitful sleep, Flavia lit the last bit of her lamp oil and pulled out a precious piece of parchment she'd been saving. Her father, before he'd died, had been a scribe. He'd taught her to read and write, skills that were supposed to have made her a valuable marriage prospect. Instead, they'd become just another reminder of a life that could have been. But tonight, those skills might save her son's life. Flavia dipped her father's old stylus in ink she'd mixed from charcoal and water, and began to write, "To the honored prefect of the grain supply, my name is Flavia. widow of Lucius Maximus, soldier of the 3rd Legion. My husband died in service to Rome in the Dacian campaigns. I write not to beg for wealth or favor, but only for what is necessary to keep my infant son alive. I am not asking for gold or land. I am asking only for milk and bread, enough to sustain a mother so that she might sustain her child. My son is 3 months old. His father died defending the empire. I am asking the empire to ensure his death was not in vain by allowing his son to survive. I have 1 bronze coin to my name. I am willing to work. I can read, write, wash, clean, anything required. But I cannot work and simultaneously care for my infant, and I cannot afford anyone to mind him while I labor. I do not know if this letter will reach you, or if you have the authority or inclination to help one widow among thousands. But I am writing because I have tried everything else, and the only option left is to watch my son starve. Please, if there is any mercy in Rome, let it find us now. Flavia, widow of Lucius Maximus, Subura district, 3rd Insula from the fountain. She read it over twice, checking for errors, for anything that might offend or put off the recipient. It was honest, direct, and, she hoped, compelling enough that whoever read it might be moved to action. The problem was getting it delivered. In the morning, Flavia wrapped Marcus in his sling and made her way to the administrative district near the Forum. The prefecture of the grain supply was a massive building, constantly surrounded by petitioners, merchants, and officials conducting the complex business of feeding Rome's 1 million inhabitants. Flavia waited for 3 hours, bouncing Marcus gently when he fussed, trying to make herself as small and non-threatening as possible. Finally, a young clerk emerged to collect the day's correspondence. "Please," Flavia said, pressing her letter into his hands. "For the prefect. It's urgent." The clerk barely glanced at it. "The prefect receives 100 letters a day. If it's about personal assistance, you should petition through the proper—" "Please," Flavia interrupted, hearing the desperation in her own voice. "Just, please ensure he receives it. It's about a soldier's widow. About keeping a soldier's son alive." The clerk's expression softened slightly. "I'll do what I can, but I make no promises." "Thank you," Flavia whispered. She didn't know if he would keep his word, didn't know if the letter would even make it to the prefect's desk, or if it would simply be added to a pile of similar pleas and forgotten. But she'd done the only thing she could think of. Now all she could do was wait and hope and try to keep Marcus alive for 1 more day. What Flavia didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that the young clerk, distracted and overwhelmed by his duties, would misplace her letter. That instead of being added to the prefect's correspondence, it would accidentally be included in a bundle of documents destined for a different office entirely. She didn't know that her desperate plea for milk and bread would end up on the desk of the most powerful man in the Roman Empire. She didn't know that Emperor Hadrian, working late into the night on matters of state, would pause while reviewing grain distribution reports and notice a personal letter that clearly didn't belong in the stack. She didn't know that he would read her words by lamplight, his expression growing more thoughtful with each line. She didn't know that for the first time in months, someone with the power to actually help her was about to take an interest in her plight. All Flavia knew was that Marcus was still crying, her milk had dried to almost nothing, and she had perhaps 3 more days before the landlord threw them into the street. She sat in her small room that night, rocking her son and singing a lullaby her mother had sung to her, trying to pretend that everything would somehow work out, trying to believe that somewhere, somehow, her letter had found someone who cared. And in the imperial palace across the city, Emperor Hadrian read the letter a second time, then a third, his expression unreadable. Finally, he set it down and summoned his personal guard. "Find this woman," he commanded, "but do it quietly. I want to see the truth for myself." Emperor Hadrian read the letter a 4th time, the words cutting through the administrative tedium of grain reports and tax assessments like a blade through silk. "I'm not asking for gold or land. I'm asking only for milk and bread." He'd been emperor for 6 years now, had received thousands of petitions, pleas, and demands. Most wanted something grand: land grants, tax exemptions, political appointments. The wealthy wanted more wealth. The powerful wanted more power. Even the poor, when they managed to get a petition through, usually asked for substantial sums that they imagined would solve all their problems. But this woman, this widow of a soldier who had died in Hadrian's own campaigns, asked only for enough to keep her infant son alive. There was something brutally honest about it, something that pierced through all the rhetoric and political maneuvering. She wasn't trying to manipulate him with flattery. She was simply stating facts. Her husband died serving Rome. She couldn't feed their child. She needed help. Marcus Ulpius, Hadrian called, and his personal secretary appeared from the antechamber. "Yes, divine Caesar." "This letter," Hadrian said, holding up Flavia's parchment. "It was in the grain distribution reports. How did it get there?" Marcus Ulpius squinted at it, then consulted his notes. "It appears to have been misfiled, Caesar. It was meant for the prefecture of grain supply, but was accidentally included in your evening reports." "A fortunate accident," Hadrian murmured. "Tell me, how many soldiers died in the Dacian campaigns?" "The official count is approximately 3,000, divine Caesar, though the actual number is likely higher." "And how many of those 3,000 left widows, children?" Marcus Ulpius hesitated. "We don't maintain comprehensive records of soldiers' families, Caesar. The military discharge payments go to their designated heirs, but tracking the ongoing welfare of widows and children, we don't bother," Hadrian finished for him. "We pay them their 40 denarii and consider our obligation fulfilled." "It is the traditional arrangement, Caesar." "Traditional," Hadrian repeated, the word tasting sour. "If 3,000 soldiers died and half left widows, that's 1,500 women suddenly without support. How many do you think are starving, desperate one step from selling their bodies?" Marcus Ulpius shifted uncomfortably. "I cannot say, Caesar, but such is the nature of war." "Consequences," Hadrian said flatly. He stood, pacing to the window overlooking Rome's lights. "I ordered those campaigns. I sent those men to die. And this woman, she's not asking me to bring her husband back. She's asking only that his son be allowed to live. What would you have me do, Caesar?" Hadrian made a decision. "I want to see her, but not as emperor. I want to understand the truth without the distortion that imperial presence creates. Find her. The letter gives her location, and arrange for me to visit the market district tomorrow, dressed as a common citizen." Marcus Ulpius looked alarmed. "Divine Caesar, that would be dangerous. The Suburra is not safe." "I've fought in wars, Marcus. I think I can handle a market district. Select 2 of the Praetorian Guard, ones who can blend in. Have them dress as laborers and shadow me from a distance. But Caesar, if anything should happen, then you'll have the excitement of selecting a new emperor," Hadrian replied dryly. "But nothing will happen. I just want to see with my own eyes how a soldier's widow survives in the city my wars have helped create." The next morning, Hadrian dressed in plain tunic and worn sandals. Looking at himself in the bronze mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back. Without the purple-bordered toga, without the laurel crown, he was just another middle-aged man with graying hair and military bearing. 2 guards, Cassius and Rufus, both veterans, accompanied him dressed as day laborers. To any observer, they would appear to be 3 men heading to market. The Suburra district was exactly as bad as Hadrian had imagined. The streets were narrow and filthy, buildings crowded so close that sunlight barely penetrated. The smell of unwashed bodies, rotting garbage, and human waste was overwhelming. This was where Rome's poorest lived, crammed into insulae that regularly collapsed or caught fire. And this was where a soldier's widow was forced to survive. Following Marcus's directions, Hadrian found the fountain that served as a landmark. From there, he could see the 3rd insula, a 5-story structure that looked one strong wind away from collapse. But he didn't approach. Instead, he positioned himself near the fountain and waited. It wasn't long before she appeared. Flavia was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 23, though hardship had added years to her face. She was thin, far too thin, wearing a patched tunic and sandals that were more string than leather. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and against her chest, wrapped in an old cloak, was the infant. Hadrian watched as she moved through the market with desperate efficiency. She paused at a bread stall, calculating, then moved on. Stopped at a fruit vendor, looked at prices, walked away. Every motion spoke of careful rationing, of impossible choices. The infant began to cry, a thin, weak sound. Flavia immediately shifted the baby, trying to soothe him, but the crying continued. She ducked into an alley and Hadrian saw her shoulders slump with despair. After several minutes, she emerged, the baby still fussing but quieter. She approached a vendor selling milk. "Please," Hadrian heard her say, "I have 2 bronze coins. Could you spare even a small amount? My son needs—" "2 coins won't buy you anything here," the vendor interrupted. "Milk's expensive right now. Try coming back when you have real money." Flavia nodded and moved away, but Hadrian saw the way her hand went to the baby's head. the gentle, protective gesture that spoke of love and helplessness. He made his decision. Hadrian approached her as she stood near another stall. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "I couldn't help but overhear. You need milk for your child?" Flavia turned to face him, wary. "I do, but I can't afford—" "Here," Hadrian interrupted, pulling out a small pouch. Inside were 20 denarii, enough to feed her and the baby for weeks. "Take this. Buy what you need." Flavia stared at the pouch, then at him, and something unexpected happened. Instead of gratitude, her expression hardened. "I don't want charity." "It's not charity," Hadrian said, surprised. "It's money I didn't earn," Flavia interrupted, her chin lifting. "I wrote a letter asking for help finding work, for a chance to provide for my son, not for handouts from strangers." Hadrian found himself genuinely taken aback. He'd expected tears of gratitude. Instead, this woman, who clearly needed the money desperately, was refusing it on principle. "You have an infant," he pointed out. "Pride is a luxury you can't afford." "Pride is the only thing I have left," Flavia said, steel in her voice despite her exhaustion. "My husband died for Rome. That means something." "It should mean something. Not charity from strangers, but recognition that a soldier's sacrifice created an obligation. And if Rome doesn't recognize that obligation, then Rome is failing," Flavia said simply. "But that doesn't mean I have to fail too. I'll find work, somehow. I'll keep my son alive, but I'll do it with dignity." The baby began to cry again, more insistently. Flavia's resolve visibly wavered as she looked down at her son, then back at the pouch. For a moment, Hadrian thought she might take it, but she didn't. Instead, she turned and walked away, her head high despite her obvious desperation. Hadrian watched her go, something stirring in his chest. Admiration, perhaps. This woman, with nothing, was more concerned with dignity than survival. She understood something fundamental about what it meant to be Roman, that how you lived mattered as much as whether you lived. "Caesar," Cassius murmured, appearing at his elbow. "What would you have us do?" "Follow her," Hadrian commanded quietly. "Make sure she gets home safely. Then find out who runs the palace kitchens. I want to create a position, a scribe's assistant, something similar. Something respectable that pays enough to support a woman and an infant. Arrange it so it appears to come through normal channels, not directly from me. You're going to help her without her knowing?" "She doesn't want charity," Hadrian replied. "She wants work, so we'll give her work. Just don't tell her who arranged it. Not yet. And how will we notify her?" Hadrian considered. "A letter, sealed with a golden eagle, anonymous but official looking. The golden eagle of Jupiter? Or of Rome itself?" Hadrian replied. "Let her think the gods are watching over her. Perhaps they are." As they made their way back to the palace, Hadrian couldn't stop thinking about Flavia's expression when she'd refused his money, about the strength it took to turn down help when you desperately needed it. This woman understood something his advisors had forgotten, that Rome was more than territory and legions. It was a promise that service to the state meant something, that sacrifice would be honored. He'd sent her husband to die. The least he could do was ensure that death hadn't been meaningless. By nightfall, arrangements had been made. A letter would be delivered in the morning, offering her a position in the palace administrative offices. It would pay enough to support her and the child, include provisions for housing, and carry the seal of the Golden Eagle. She would never know that the emperor himself had arranged it, but she would have work, she would have dignity, and her son would have milk. That, Hadrian thought, was worth any amount of subterfuge. The letter arrived at dawn, slipped under Flavia's door by a messenger who disappeared before she could answer his knock. She found it when Marcus woke her with his crying, as he did every morning now. Hungry, desperate, his small body trembling with need. Flavia had been awake most of the night anyway, trying to decide what to do when the landlord came for rent in 3 days. She had no money left. The 2 bronze coins from yesterday had bought a small piece of bread that she'd eaten herself, hoping it would help her body produce milk. It wasn't working. She picked up the sealed parchment with trembling hands, almost afraid to open it. Letters meant news, and news was rarely good. Perhaps it was an eviction notice. Perhaps, she broke the seal, a golden eagle pressed into red wax, and unfolded the letter. To Flavia, widow of Lucius Maximus, you are hereby offered a position within the imperial administrative offices, serving as assistant to the chief scribe of the palace kitchens. Your duties will include maintaining supply records, correspondence with vendors, and general clerical support. The position provides salary of 15 denarii per month, Quarters in the palace servants' wing, 2 rooms suitable for yourself and 1 child, daily meal provisions, access to the palace physician. If you accept, present this letter at the Palatine Gate at the 2nd hour tomorrow. You will be escorted to your quarters and provided with appropriate clothing for your duties. No response is required. Simply appear, or do not. Sealed by order of the Golden Eagle, Flavia read it 3 times, certain she must be misunderstanding. 15 denarii per month was more than most laborers earned. Quarters in the palace, actual rooms, daily meals, access to a physician. It was impossible. It had to be some kind of mistake. But the seal looked official, and the parchment was quality that no one would waste on a prank. And the timing, just days after she'd written her desperate plea, was too precise to be coincidence. Her letter had reached someone with power, someone who had decided to help her. Marcus's crying intensified. She had one day to keep him alive before she could accept this offer. If it was real. Flavia looked at the letter again, at the promise of safety, and made a decision. She would believe it was real. She would act as if the gods had finally heard her prayers, and tomorrow she would present herself at the Palatine Gate. But first, she needed to feed her son. With careful hands, she wrapped Marcus in his sling, tucked the precious letter into her tunic, and headed to the temple of Vesta, where the sacred flame burned, and where, legend said, the goddess sometimes answered the prayers of desperate mothers. The temple was nearly empty at this early hour. A few petitioners knelt before the flame, and the Vestal virgins moved through their morning rituals. Flavia approached hesitantly, unsure of protocol. One of the younger Vestals noticed her, a woman perhaps 30 years old with kind eyes. "You're troubled," the Vestal observed quietly. "My son," Flavia said, her voice breaking. "He's starving. I can't feed him. I've tried everything and She stopped, unable to continue. The Vestal looked at Marcus, at his thin face and weak movements, and her expression shifted to something like pain. "Come," she said simply, and led Flavia to a small room off the main temple. Inside, another woman sat nursing an infant, clearly one of the temple servants who had recently given birth. The Vestal spoke to her quietly, and after a moment, the woman nodded. "She'll nurse your son," the Vestal explained. "We cannot solve all of Rome's suffering, but we can at least ensure 1 child eats today." Flavia watched through tears as the temple servant took Marcus and put him to her breast. The baby latched on immediately, feeding with desperate hunger, and for the first time in days, Flavia felt something like hope. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." "I don't know how to repay. Repayment isn't necessary," the Vestal interrupted gently. "But tell me, do you have prospects? Some way to care for him beyond today?" Flavia pulled out the letter, showing it to the Vestal. "This came this morning. I don't know if it's real, but if it is..." The Vestal examined the seal, and her eyebrows rose. "The Golden Eagle. This is legitimate. I've seen such seals before, on official correspondence. Someone with significant authority has taken an interest in your welfare." "But who?" Flavia asked. "I wrote to the grain prefect, but surely he doesn't have the power to..." "Perhaps your letter reached someone else," the Vestal suggested. "Or perhaps someone brought your situation to higher authority. Either way, this is genuine. You should accept." "I will," Flavia said. "Tomorrow, at the 2nd hour." Marcus had finished nursing and now lay contentedly in the temple servant's arms, his small face peaceful for the first time in days. Flavia felt something unknot in her chest. "Stay for the morning meal," the Vestal offered. "You look as though you could use proper food yourself, and your son can nurse again before you leave." Flavia accepted gratefully, and for the first time in months, she ate until she was full. The temple food was simple: bread, cheese, diluted wine, some fruit, but it was abundant and freely given. As she ate, she watched Marcus sleep peacefully and allowed herself to imagine a future where this wasn't a rare miracle, but daily reality. The next morning, Flavia dressed in her least-worn tunic, braided her hair as neatly as she could manage, and wrapped Marcus in the cleanest cloth she possessed. She arrived at the Palatine Gate precisely at the 2nd hour, the letter clutched in her hand, her heart pounding. The guards at the gate examined her letter, conferred briefly, and then, to her overwhelming relief, nodded and stepped aside. "Follow me," one of them said, and led her through passages she'd only ever seen from a distance, through corridors of marble and gold. They arrived at a modest section of the palace, clearly servants' quarters, but still far superior to anything Flavia had ever lived in. 2 rooms, as promised, one with a sleeping pallet and a small cradle, the other with a desk, a chair, and shelves. "Your quarters," the guard said. "The chief scribe will meet with you after the midday meal to explain your duties. Until then, familiarize yourself with the space. Meal provisions are available in the servants' hall. Follow the corridor to the left. Someone will be by later with appropriate clothing." He left before Flavia could find words to thank him. She stood in the center of the room, her room, and slowly turned, taking it all in. Clean walls, a real bed, a window with shutters, a cradle for Marcus with blankets that weren't threadbare. It was real. All of it was real. Flavia sank down onto the bed and cried. "Great," shaking sobs of relief and gratitude. Marcus, startled, began to fuss, and she pulled him close. "We're safe," she whispered to him. "We're safe now. Someone saw us. Someone cared. Someone with a golden eagle for a seal decided we were worth saving." She didn't know who her mysterious benefactor was, didn't know if she'd ever learn their identity. But in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that her son would eat, that they would have shelter, that the desperate fear that had defined every moment was finally beginning to ease. That night, after meeting the chief scribe, a stern but fair woman named Claudia, who outlined her duties, after eating a proper meal, after nursing Marcus with milk that had finally started to return, Flavia lay in her new bed and thought about the stranger in the market, the man who had offered her money that she'd refused. She'd been so proud, so determined to maintain her dignity, that she'd turned down help she desperately needed, and yet somehow, that same pride had led to this, to a position that allowed her to work, to earn her keep, to provide for her son without compromising her principles. Had the stranger been connected to this offer? Had her refusal of charity impressed someone enough to offer her work instead? She'd never know for certain. But as she drifted off to sleep, secure for the first time in months, Flavia sent up a silent prayer to whatever gods or mysterious benefactors might be listening. "Thank you for seeing me, for hearing me, for deciding I was worth saving." In his private chambers, Emperor Hadrian received the report from Cassius that Flavia had accepted the position and was settling into her quarters. He nodded, satisfied, and returned to the mountain of correspondence that always awaited him. One crisis averted, one widow saved, one soldier's sacrifice honored, however belatedly. It was a small thing in the grand scheme of empire, but it was something, and for now, that was enough. Months passed, like water flowing downhill, steady, inevitable, transforming everything in its path. Flavia discovered that she was good at her work, more than good. The skills her father had taught her, reading, writing, accounting, combined with a natural organizational ability she hadn't known she possessed, made her invaluable to Claudia, the chief scribe. Within weeks, she was handling correspondence that would have taken others days. Within months, she was trusted with supplier negotiations and inventory management previously reserved for senior staff. Marcus thrived. With regular meals, a warm room, and access to the palace physician, the infant who had been on the edge of starvation transformed into a healthy, robust baby. He smiled now, laughed when Flavia played with him, and had begun to recognize the other servants who cooed over him. But throughout it all, Flavia never forgot the golden eagle seal, never stopped wondering who had saved them. She asked Claudia once carefully, "The position I was offered, who authorized it? I'd like to thank them properly." Claudia had looked at her with an unreadable expression. "Administrative appointments come from various offices. The specific authority isn't always clear. Why do you ask?" "I received a letter," Flavia explained. "Sealed with a golden eagle. I assumed it was from someone specific." "The golden eagle could represent many things," Claudia replied carefully. "Jupiter's symbol, Rome itself. If someone wanted you to know who they were, they would have identified themselves. Perhaps it's best to simply be grateful and not question its source too deeply." The message was clear. Don't ask. So Flavia stopped asking, but she never stopped wondering. As her immediate survival was no longer in question, she began to notice the larger injustices around her. The palace employed dozens of servants, many in situations similar to her own. Widows, displaced persons, those who had fallen through Rome's cracks. Some were treated poorly by administrators who saw them as disposable. Some were underpaid or had wages withheld for trivial infractions. Flavia began to speak up, quietly at first, then more boldly. When a supplier tried to overcharge for grain, she confronted him with documentation proving his deception. When an administrator attempted to dock the pay of a servant who had taken time off for a sick child, She argued successfully that the policy was cruel and counterproductive. She developed a reputation. Some called her the widow with the sharp tongue. Others called her the one who doesn't know her place. But Claudia, watching carefully, called her effective and gave her more responsibility. One afternoon, about 6 months after she'd started, Flavia was working in the records room when she overheard a conversation in the adjacent corridor. "The Emperor himself arranged it," a voice said, one of the senior administrators. "Used his personal seal, the Golden Eagle. Quite unusual." Flavia froze, her stylus hovering over the parchment. "Why would the Emperor involve himself in hiring a kitchen scribe's assistant?" Another voice asked. "Who knows? You know how he is, always doing unexpected things, reading petitions that should go to subordinates, walking through the city in disguise. He's brilliant but unconventional. Still, to personally arrange employment for a widow. I heard she wrote a letter that somehow ended up on his desk. Something about it moved him." The voices faded, but Flavia remained frozen, her mind reeling. The Emperor. Her mysterious benefactor was Emperor Hadrian himself. The realization was overwhelming. The most powerful man in the Roman Empire had read her desperate plea, had dressed as a common citizen and observed her in the market, had arranged her employment personally, and she had refused his money, had lectured him about dignity and obligation, had turned her back on the Emperor of Rome. The question now was, what did she do with this knowledge? For several days, Flavia wrestled with it. Should she request an audience? Should she attempt to thank him formally? The decision was taken from her when Claudia summoned her one morning. "The Emperor has requested a report on kitchen supply management," Claudia explained, her expression carefully neutral. "Your work on the supplier contracts has been noticed. You're to present the findings directly to him. This afternoon, the 6th hour." Flavia's stomach dropped. "Directly to the Emperor?" "It's highly unusual," Claudia acknowledged. "But he specifically asked for you. You should consider it an honor." At the 6th hour, Flavia found herself standing outside the Emperor's private study, Marcus, because she'd had no time to take him to the nursery, wrapped in a sling against her chest. She wore her best tunic and had braided her hair with extra care. In her hands, she clutched the supply report. "Enter," a voice called in response to her knock. Flavia pushed open the door and stepped into a room that was surprisingly modest. She'd expected gold and purple, ostentatious displays of power. Instead, she found a study filled with scrolls, maps, and the organized chaos of someone who actually worked in their space. And sitting behind a desk covered in correspondence was the man from the market, the stranger who had offered her money, Emperor Hadrian. He looked up and their eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, slowly, Hadrian smiled. "Flavia," he said simply, "I wondered when you'd figure it out." "You're—" Flavia started, then stopped, suddenly aware that she was addressing the Emperor while holding an infant. "Divine Caesar, Please," Hadrian interrupted gently. "Let's dispense with the formalities. Close the door and sit. You look as though you might faint, and I'd rather not explain to Claudia why I let her best assistant collapse in my study." Flavia obeyed. Marcus, sensing her tension, began to fuss. "Your son is well?" Hadrian asked conversationally. "He is," Flavia managed. "Thanks to you. You're the one who sent the letter, who arranged my position. You're the Golden Eagle." "I am," Hadrian confirmed. "Though I should clarify, the Golden Eagle isn't meant to represent me personally, but the authority of Rome itself. The idea being that Rome saw your need and responded. But you—" Flavia struggled to organize her thoughts. "You're the Emperor. Why would you involve yourself in the problems of one widow? Surely you have more important matters." "Do I?" Hadrian interrupted. "What's more important than ensuring that a soldier's sacrifice doesn't result in his family's destruction? What's more important than making certain that the people I send to die for Rome are honored by Rome?" He stood and moved to the window. "Your letter ended up on my desk by accident, a filing error. But I read it, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. Here was a woman asking not for wealth or status, but simply for enough to keep her child alive. A woman whose husband died in my campaigns. And Rome's response was to give her 40 denarii and forget she existed. The traditional arrangement," Flavia said quietly. "Traditional," Hadrian agreed. "Like so many things that are traditional and wrong. I wanted to see for myself what kind of woman writes such a letter. So I dressed as a common citizen and went to the market." "And I refused your money," Flavia said, the memory making her wince. "I lectured the Emperor of Rome about dignity." To her surprise, Hadrian laughed, a genuine sound. "You did, And do you know what I thought? Flavia shook her head. I thought, here is someone who understands what Rome is supposed to be. Not a system of charity and handouts, but a covenant, service in exchange for honor. You didn't want my pity. You wanted Rome to fulfill its obligations. That's rare and admirable. He returned to his desk. So I arranged the position, because you were right. You deserved work, not charity. And from what Claudia tells me, you've more than justified that decision. Flavia felt tears threatening. I don't know what to say. Say nothing. Hadrian replied gently. Or rather, tell me about these supply contracts you've renegotiated. I'm genuinely curious how you managed to reduce costs by 15% while improving quality. For the next hour, Flavia presented her findings, and to her amazement, the emperor listened intently, asked intelligent questions, and seemed genuinely interested. He treated her not as a subordinate to be tolerated, but as an expert whose knowledge he valued. Only as she was preparing to leave did he address the matter directly again. Flavia, he said quietly, I don't want gratitude. I don't want you to feel indebted. I simply want you to continue doing good work and raising your son well. That's thanks enough. But why? Flavia asked. Why me? Why not all the other widows? All the other desperate people? I can't save everyone. Hadrian admitted. I'm emperor, but I'm not omnipotent. But I can save some. And perhaps, by saving one widow, by ensuring that one soldier's sacrifice is honored, I can begin to change how Rome treats all its widows, all its soldiers' families. He paused. Your letter reached me by accident. But perhaps there are no accidents. Perhaps the gods meant for me to see it, to be reminded that an empire is only as strong as its care for the weakest among its citizens. Flavia held Marcus close, overwhelmed by the complexity of the man before her, an emperor who dressed as a common citizen to understand his subjects, who personally reviewed kitchen supply contracts, who cared about the fate of one widow and one infant. Thank you, she said simply, for seeing me, for hearing me. You've proven yourself every day, Hadrian replied. Now go, and Flavia, the Golden Eagle will continue watching, not because you need supervision, but because Rome takes care of its own. Remember that. As she left the emperor's study, Flavia felt transformed. She'd been saved not by a distant authority, but by a man who believed that power carried obligation, that leadership meant service, that an empire's greatness was measured not in territory conquered but in lives uplifted. It was a lesson she would carry with her, and one day pass on to her son. 2 years later, famine came to Rome. It started in Egypt, where the Nile's annual flooding failed for the second consecutive year. The grain shipments that fed Rome's 1 million inhabitants began to dwindle, then stopped altogether. Prices in the markets doubled, then tripled. The emperor opened the imperial granaries, but even those vast reserves couldn't sustain the city indefinitely. Rome, which had conquered the known world, found itself facing an enemy that couldn't be defeated with legions. Hunger. Flavia watched the crisis unfold from her position in the palace administrative offices. She'd been promoted twice in 2 years, now serving as senior logistics coordinator, a title that meant she oversaw not just kitchen supplies but the entire palace provisioning system. It was a position of genuine authority, one that would have been unthinkable for a widow from the Subura just years earlier. But authority meant responsibility, and as the famine deepened, Flavia felt that responsibility weighing on her like a physical burden. The palace itself would be fine. The emperor's household had reserves, connections, resources that ordinary citizens couldn't access. But Flavia couldn't stop thinking about the people outside the marble walls, the women like she had been, trying to feed children on nothing, the families watching their savings evaporate as bread prices climbed beyond reach. She'd been there. She knew what that desperation felt like. One morning, as she reviewed inventory reports that showed comfortable palace surpluses while the city starved, Flavia made a decision that would change everything. She requested an audience with the emperor. Hadrian received her in the same modest study where they'd first spoken honestly 2 years earlier. Marcus, now an energetic toddler, played quietly in the corner with wooden toys that one of the palace guards had carved for him. Flavia. Hadrian greeted her warmly. It's been too long since we've spoken directly. Claudia tells me you're practically running the entire provisioning system now, which is why I'm here, Flavia said, dispensing with pleasantries. 2 years of working in the palace had taught her that Hadrian valued directness. The city is starving while the palace has surplus. We need to do something. The granaries are open, Hadrian replied. We're distributing grain at subsidized prices. It's not enough, Flavia interrupted, then caught herself. Forgive me, Divine Caesar, but it's not enough. The subsidized prices are still beyond what the poorest families can afford. They need more than cheap grain. They need organized distribution. They need preparation facilities. They need— She stopped, gathering her courage. They need someone who understands what it's like to be desperate. Hadrian leaned back in his chair, studying her. What are you proposing? Let me organize it, Flavia said. Give me authority over famine relief. Not the grain prefects who've never missed a meal. Not the administrators who see hungry people as numbers in reports. Me, someone who's been there. Someone who knows what these families actually need. You want to run Rome's famine relief? Hadrian asked, his tone unreadable. I want to save lives, Flavia corrected. I want to make sure that no mother has to watch her child starve, the way I almost had to watch Marcus starve. I know I'm just a widow, just a former scribe's assistant, but you're the woman who turned down the emperor's charity because you valued dignity over survival. Hadrian interrupted. You're the administrator who's revolutionized palace logistics and saved more money than anyone thought possible. You're someone who understands both poverty and efficiency. If anything, you're overqualified. He stood and moved to the window overlooking the city. The Senate will object. The grain prefects will see it as an insult. The noble families will mock the idea of a widow from the Subura directing imperial policy. Let them mock, Flavia said quietly. While they mock, children will eat. Hadrian turned back to her, and something like approval flickered across his face. Very well. I'll issue the decree today. You'll have full authority over famine relief operations, reporting directly to me. Whatever resources you need, whatever personnel, whatever access, you'll have it. But Flavia, his tone turned serious, this will make you enemies. Powerful ones. Are you prepared for that? My husband died for Rome, Flavia replied. I almost watched my son die because Rome forgot us. I'm not afraid of powerful men who've never known hunger. Within a week, Flavia had transformed Rome's famine response. Instead of simply distributing raw grain that many families lacked the means to mill or bake, she established communal kitchens throughout the city. Women who knew how to cook, many of them widows themselves, grateful for paid work, prepared bread, porridge, and simple stews. Distribution happened at regular times in every district, organized by neighborhood representatives who knew their communities. She requisitioned empty warehouses and converted them into feeding stations. She negotiated with merchants, sometimes cajoling, sometimes threatening to use imperial authority to commandeer supplies. She worked 18-hour days, Marcus often sleeping in a corner of whatever building she was currently organizing, and she demanded the same dedication from everyone who worked under her. And it worked. Within 2 weeks, the death rate from starvation dropped by half. Within a month, no one in Rome was dying from simple lack of food. But success brought exactly the opposition Hadrian had predicted. She's overstepping, Senator Brutus complained in the Senate. This woman, this widow, is commanding senators and equestrians as if she had actual authority. She's refused entry to grain merchants I personally vouched for, accused them of hoarding and price manipulation. It's unconscionable. She's effective, Hadrian replied calmly from his seat. More effective than anyone else has been. The people are being fed. At what cost to dignity and proper order? Another senator demanded. She's a woman of low birth who's forgotten her place. She speaks to senators as if they were her subordinates. She makes demands of the grain prefects as if she had the right to command them. She does have that right, Hadrian said, his voice carrying an edge now. I gave it to her, and she's using it to save lives while you gentlemen debate propriety. Tell me, Senator, how many Romans were dying each day before Flavia took control of famine relief? And how many are dying now? The senators had no answer. The nobles called her the beggar empress behind her back, meant as an insult. But the common people heard the name and embraced it differently. They saw a woman who had been where they were, who understood their struggles, who fought for them with the ferocity of someone who remembered what it meant to be powerless. They called her Mother of Rome. One evening, exhausted after another endless day of organizing distribution and battling bureaucratic resistance, Flavia returned to her quarters to find the emperor waiting outside her door. Divine Caesar, she said, immediately straightening despite her fatigue. I wasn't expecting. Walk with me, Hadrian said simply. They walked through the palace gardens, Marcus dozing in Flavia's arms, while Hadrian spoke quietly. Do you know why I really gave you this authority? He asked. Because you thought I could be effective? That was part of it, Hadrian agreed. But mostly because I wanted the Senate to see something. I wanted them to watch a widow from the Subura, someone they would normally dismiss without a second thought, prove herself more capable, more dedicated, and more honorable than most of them will ever be. He paused by a fountain. You're not just feeding the hungry, Flavia. You're demonstrating that merit matters more than birth, that someone's value isn't determined by their family name or their wealth. You're showing Rome what it could be, rather than what it is. I'm just trying to keep people from starving, Flavia said quietly. You're doing much more than that, Hadrian replied. And the Senate knows it. That's why they're so threatened. Because if a widow can run famine relief better than career administrators, what does that say about all their assumptions about who deserves power? Months later, when the Egyptian grain shipments finally resumed and the famine ended, the Senate held a formal ceremony to acknowledge those who had served Rome during the crisis. Flavia was required to attend. She stood in the Senate chamber, the same chamber where nobles had mocked her as the beggar in silk, and listened as Emperor Hadrian addressed Rome's most powerful citizens. Many contributed to Rome's survival during the famine, he said, but one person, above all others, demonstrated what true service means. A woman who asked for nothing but the chance to help, who worked without rest, who treated the hungry not as numbers, but as human beings deserving of dignity. He looked directly at Flavia. The woman who once begged for milk taught Rome the meaning of mercy. Let her name be remembered not with mockery, but with honor. Let her be an example of what Rome can be when we remember that greatness is measured not in conquest, but in compassion. The Senate chamber was silent. Then, slowly, grudgingly, the senators rose and applauded. It wasn't universal approval. Some clapped out of political necessity rather than genuine respect. But it was acknowledgement, recognition that Flavia had earned her place not through birth or connections, but through competence and dedication. And that night, as Flavia put Marcus to bed, she thought about the journey that had brought her from the Subura to the Senate chamber, about the letter she'd written in desperation that had somehow reached an emperor, about the stranger in the market who had offered her money she'd refused, about all the moments that had seemed like endings but were actually beginnings. Your father would be proud, she whispered to Marcus. He died believing in Rome, and maybe, just maybe, we're making a Rome worthy of that belief. The boy smiled in his sleep, and Flavia allowed herself to believe for a moment that it might actually be true. 20 years later, Emperor Hadrian was dying. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the slow inevitability of a man who had lived 62 years and could feel his body failing piece by piece. His physicians did what they could, but even imperial power couldn't hold back time forever. In his private chamber, surrounded by scrolls and documents that represented decades of governance, Hadrian spent his final days reviewing his legacy. The borders he'd secured, the buildings he'd commissioned, the laws he'd reformed. But one thing occupied his thoughts more than all the rest. A single letter, kept in a locked box on his desk for 20 years. Parchment yellowed with age, ink faded, but still readable. The desperate plea of a widow who had asked only for milk and bread. Marcus Ulpius, now an old man himself, entered the chamber carrying the day's correspondence. Divine Caesar, you should rest. The physicians say I'm dying. Hadrian interrupted, his voice weak but still sharp. I'm aware. But before I go, there's something I need to do. Send for Flavia. The Lady Flavia retired from public service 5 years ago, Marcus reminded him gently. She lives quietly now, with her son and his family. I know where she lives, Hadrian said. I've always known. Send for her. Tell her an old friend wishes to say goodbye. 2 days later, Flavia arrived at the palace. She was 43 now, her dark hair streaked with gray, her face marked by years of hard work and harder choices, but her eyes were still the same, intelligent, compassionate, unbowed. She was escorted to Hadrian's bedside, where the Emperor of Rome lay propped against pillows, looking smaller than she remembered. Divine Caesar, she said softly, settling into the chair beside his bed. I came as soon as I received word. Thank you, Hadrian replied. And please, after 20 years, I think we can dispense with the formalities. I'm just a dying old man who wanted to see an old friend. Flavia smiled sadly. You were never just anything. You changed my life, changed Rome. Perhaps, Hadrian allowed, but you changed me as well, made me understand something I'd forgotten. He gestured to the locked box on his desk. Would you open that for me? I lack the strength. Flavia retrieved the box and opened it carefully. Inside, she found her letter, the one she'd written in desperation so many years ago. "You kept it," she breathed. "I did," Hadrian confirmed. "I've kept it all these years because I needed to remember something important." "Do you know what you taught me, Flavia?" She shook her head. "You taught me that empires aren't built by swords," Hadrian said quietly. "They're built by mothers, by people who care whether children eat, whether families survive, whether the vulnerable are protected. I conquered territory, yes. I built walls and aqueducts and temples. But you saved lives. You changed how Rome treats its people. That's worth more than all my monuments." "You're being too generous," Flavia protested. "I'm being honest," Hadrian corrected, "which is a luxury of the dying. We no longer have to maintain polite fictions." He paused, gathering strength. "Your son, Marcus, how is he?" "He's well," Flavia said, her voice warming. "He became a scholar, as you know. Teaches rhetoric and philosophy. He has 2 children of his own now. A good life, thanks to you." "Thanks to you," Hadrian corrected. "I simply gave you an opportunity. You did the rest." He looked at the letter in her hands. "I want you to keep that, and I want you to do something for me. Anything. When I'm gone, when people ask about my reign, tell them this story. Not the wars or the buildings or the administrative reforms. Tell them about a widow who wrote a letter asking for milk. Tell them about an emperor who learned to see his subjects not as numbers but as people. Tell them that the greatest thing Rome can be is a place where desperate mothers receive answers, not silence." Tears streamed down Flavia's face. "I will, I promise." "Good," Hadrian said, and a faint smile touched his lips. "Now tell me about your grandchildren. I want to hear about ordinary life, about the kind of future you're building for them. That sounds far more interesting than anything I've done." So Flavia sat beside the dying emperor and told him stories, about her grandson who loved to draw, about her granddaughter who asked endless questions, about the simple joys of a life built on the foundation he'd given her. And Hadrian listened and smiled and felt something like peace. 3 days later, Emperor Hadrian died. The Senate declared him divine, as was tradition. Historians began compiling records of his achievements, the military campaigns, the architectural projects, the administrative reforms that had reshaped the empire. But in the temple dedicated to his memory, alongside all the official proclamations and scholarly treatises, there was a simple exhibit that drew more visitors than all the others. A letter sealed under glass, written in a woman's careful hand, a plea for milk and bread that had changed an empire, and beside it, an inscription: "Empires are built by swords, but saved by mothers." Emperor Hadrian, in his final words, Flavia lived another 20 years, long enough to see her grandchildren grown, long enough to know that the reforms she'd fought for had become permanent. Rome would never again allow soldiers' widows to starve in silence. The system wasn't perfect, nothing human ever was, but it was better, and that, she thought, was all anyone could really ask for. When she died at 63, surrounded by family, her funeral was attended by thousands. Former senators who had mocked her, citizens who had been fed by her programs, widows who had been saved by the precedents she'd set. The new emperor, Antoninus Pius, spoke at her funeral, calling her the conscience of Rome. But the epitaph carved on her tomb was simpler, chosen by her son. She asked only for milk and bread. She gave Rome mercy. And in the palace archives, in a locked room where the most important documents of the empire were kept, her original letter remained. A reminder to every emperor who came after that power meant nothing if it wasn't used to answer the desperate prayers of those who had no other voice. The Golden Eagle watched over Rome for centuries more, and whenever a new emperor took power, they were required to read Flavia's letter before their coronation, not as a formality, but as a lesson, that empires are measured not by what they conquer, but by whom they save, that mercy is never weakness, that sometimes the most important letters reach exactly who they need to reach, even if it takes a miracle or a misfiled document to get them there.